Following World War I, the United States began to form an even stronger national identity. The regional divide that characterized much of the 19th century gave way to a more national approach to politics, economics, and culture. Additionally, the dramatic influence of mass media led to nationwide advertising campaigns that targeted consumers in all parts of the United States, not just in one area. The effects of communism's rise led to strong efforts to defend the United States from its spread. Out of these conditions in the 1920s came a more solidified national identity in which the United States defended democracy and capitalism, and mass consumerism influenced culture across the nation. Even though there was much prosperity and unity in the United States after World War I, there were also significant identity and equality struggles. Unable to engage in direct action during World War I, labor unions began to strike for higher wages after the war. These strikes, thought by many to be led by communists, became increasingly more violent. According to communist philosophy, workers would eventually tire of being oppressed through low wages and poor working conditions and violently overthrow the capitalist economic system. In 1917, communist revolutionaries known as Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar in Russia. The new Bolshevik authority established the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and was led by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin called for a worldwide revolution to destroy capitalism. America thus became a pivotal target for communist infiltration. The fear of the spread of communism in the United States was heightened by Karl Marx's prediction of a worker revolution. Were the labor union strikes part of Lenin's mission in the United States? Many saw capitalism and democracy as being in danger from communist threats. The wave of fear and action to protect the United States from such ideological crises became known as the Red Scare. For the most part, Americans were unified to protect the nation's identity as a democratic and capitalist country from communism. The perceived danger was further exacerbated by a series of bombings sponsored by a group of Italian anarchists. The attacks were carried out against public buildings and officials. Terrorists twice attacked United States Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. These incidents, coupled with the violent labor strikes, led the United States Justice Department and the FBI to stage a series of raids against suspected anarchists and communists. Hundreds were arrested across the nation. However, civil libertarians claimed the Palmer raids lacked legal standing and targeted people's beliefs rather than their actions. Most of those arrested were later released, but 556 people were deported as a result of the Palmer raids. The Red Scare ended when a purported May Day plot to overthrow the government never took place, and Palmer's actions were censured for violating civil liberties. The Red Scare and terrorist activity were also factors that led to new restrictions on immigration. Other factors included two ideas that grew particularly strong during the post-World War I era of the 1920s. One of the ideas was that people born in the United States were superior to immigrants. The other was that America should keep its traditional culture intact. Anti-immigrant, anti-Jewish, and anti-Catholic sentiments contributed to the popularity of a revived Ku Klux Klan, not just in the South, but also throughout the nation. By 1924, this conservative reaction against immigrants resulted in the passage of the National Origins Acts. The main provision of the laws was to establish the quota system, which set limits on the number of immigrants who could enter the United States from each country. Americans' anti-German effort during World War I was one factor that led to a campaign to outlaw beer and other alcoholic beverages. This effort was well suited to the goals of the progressive reformers. It became patriotic during the war to abstain from alcohol, not only to preserve grain for the troops and our allies, but also as a symbol of resistance to beer's German connection. Congress passed the 18th Amendment in 1917, and it was ratified in 1919. The provisions of the amendment prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. The 18th Amendment had both positive and negative effects. Organized crime and alcohol smuggling brought tremendous profits to those willing to break the law for financial gain. Speakeasies and bootleggers profited from the banning of alcohol. In the 1930s, the 21st Amendment repealed or canceled out the 18th Amendment. The federal government benefited from making alcohol legal because taxes could be levied on it during the financial difficulties of the Great Depression. The women's movement had been actively working toward enfranchisement since the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. Tactics used by suffragists included demonstrating in front of the White House and driving cross-country motorcades to promote the cause. Ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote in 1920, was fueled by decades of women's activism. Eventually, President Wilson supported the women's right to vote, expecting that in return they would support his League of Nations. The effect of the 19th Amendment was greater equality and independence for women. Gender roles began to change during the 1920s after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. While the amendment itself is not solely responsible for the cultural changes, the greater political autonomy of women certainly emboldened their social autonomy. Women began to challenge the moral taboos of the Victorian era through their dress, activities, and attitudes. The 1920s was a time of increased consumerism as the economy improved after World War I. For the first time, installment loans were available to consumers who used them to purchase new automobiles and household appliances. Advertising of cars and new household appliances was largely through nationwide campaigns on the radio, in magazines, and at the movies. People began to see themselves as needing certain items of convenience rather than simply wanting them. Turn-of-the-century innovations changed society. New modes of individual transportation made the population more mobile and able to live greater distances from their jobs. Henry Ford developed the first mass-produced automobile, the Model T. While the idea of mass production was not new, Ford used a moving assembly line to build automobiles rapidly. Ford constructed his manufacturing facilities so that the elements of production, such as foundries, machine shops, and assembly lines, were all in one location. He also accelerated production and drove down the costs of automobiles by standardizing parts and focusing on specialization of labor. At its introduction in the market, Ford's Model T cost $950. Within 10 years, the same model cost $280 due to improved production methods. Automobiles dramatically changed American culture. People began moving to the suburbs because of their widespread ownership of cars. There was also a new need for improved roads and highways. Travel was more independent, and vacations for pleasure became popular. As a result, new businesses were needed, such as gas stations, motels, and roadside restaurants. The period after World War I marked the beginning of mass media, especially commercial radio and movies. The first radio broadcasts were used to relate the election results of the 1920 presidential election. By 1925, there were 600 radio stations across the United States, and nearly 3 million Americans had radios. Music, stories, sporting events, and news were soon being broadcast nationwide. A stronger national, rather than regional, identity emerged in the United States. Radio helped to create a common cultural experience for millions of Americans. Advertisers were quick to realize the marketing potential of radio. They began using radio to mass market the multitude of consumer goods that were developed in the period, such as washing machines, electric toasters, and laundry soap. Products and brands were becoming more widespread due to the vast market radio offered. The first movies were silent films, but by the late 1920s, the first talkies, movies with sound, were available to audiences. During this era, the movies became big business as studios churned out an average of 800 feature films annually. Some people disapproved of what they viewed as the immoral influences of movies. However, the popularity of movies was so widespread that critics were unable to challenge the entertainment's growing influence on American culture. Radio and movies were a unifying force on national culture because the styles actors and actresses wore, activities they were engaged in, and products they were using were being watched and listened to by Americans from all parts of the country simultaneously. The 1920s marked a distinct break from the Victorian culture of the previous century. In the visual arts, the modernist movement began during this period. European modern artists, whose work was first exhibited in 1913, influenced American artists. These works were impressionistic, abstract, geometric, and represented a break from the schools of Romanticism and Realism. The era also marked the beginning of the Art Deco movement. In this new form, artists began to create artistically styled furnishings using modern materials such as aluminum, plastics, and glass. In architecture, the trend of building skyscrapers accelerated. Literature in the modern era was noted for its themes of alienation and disillusionment. Writers rebelled against traditional constraints and incorporated themes deemed immoral by the previous generation. Many notable writers came out of the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance encompassed notable artistic movements celebrating African American culture. Centered in the Harlem borough of New York City, the movement produced notable works of literature, music, dance, and visual art. Writers included Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes. Hughes's poetry used the rhythms of black music, particularly blues and jazz. This allowed Hughes to experiment with a very rhythmic free verse. Hurston explored the experiences of African American females, giving them their first true voice. An important location during the Harlem Renaissance was Harlem's Cotton Club, where white audiences were exposed to jazz. By the 1920s, there were several different types of jazz, including Dixieland, that originated in New Orleans. Famous jazz musicians included Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. Jazz also influenced white composers Cole Porter and George Gershwin, known for Rhapsody in Blue and the jazz opera Porgy and Bess. The musical form was so influential that the era of the 1920s is often referred to as the Jazz Age.